also happy to welcome you to our side events at COP29, which is on shaping our vision for climate mobility at OEM Climate Change and Human Mobility Pavilion. And welcome everyone. So we are going to have an hour for this event. And of course, there will be also a Q&A session so that we can have our good conversations. And thank you very much once again for joining us. I would now welcome Ms. Hop, Mrs. Hop, Amy Pop, please, sorry, Amy Pop, the IOM Director General, for the opening remarks. And hand over to you, Mrs. Pop Amy. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's so good to be here with all of you. And I'm actually quite relieved that this is a silent panel because I'm losing my voice. So I don't actually have to project. I can just speak right into the microphone. So first of all, I just want to say a very, very warm welcome to all of you who joined us for this conversation. And of course, to IOM's youth delegate, Israel, who has been, who's leading today's panel, moderating today's panel. Bringing youth into the conversation is a high priority for us. Number one, because they're bringing energy. They are bringing a sense of the future, a sense of the urgency. And frankly, without young people being part of the advocacy efforts, we won't have the kind of success that we need. So thank you so much. I also, we're missing one of our panelists who will be joining us, I think, midway through. Hopefully, Mr. Jagan Javagang, who's the Secretary General of the IFRC and a good friend and partner to IOM. And I'm here with Elisa Morguera, the Special Reporter on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in the context of climate change. And of course, with Laura Pavlovich, who is the USAID Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator. Now, we're all here because we all know the impact of climate change on vulnerable communities around the world. And, you know, we also know that climate change is not discriminating based on class or region or community. What we saw in Spain recently obviously was devastating to communities living in relatively highly resilient parts of the world. Now you play that out in places like Chad or Nigeria, to what we've seen across West Africa recently, of course what we've seen in Bangladesh, China, the Philippines right now as we speak. And we know that climate change is displacing people at records that I don't think anyone really anticipated. We currently are tracking that 26 million people last year were displaced by climate-related incidents. And frankly, what's really astonishing and I think not well understood right now is that climate is displacing more people each year than conflict. So to give you a sense, I mean, everybody talks about conflict displacement. It gets a lot of attention. Very few people recognize what's happening in terms of climate displacement. We know that people are moving, often in the first time they're moving within their country, but they're moving in countries that often don't have the resilience, don't have the infrastructure, don't have the capacity to respond to those movements. And so people end up in a much more vulnerable situation. I saw that actually, I was just in Sudan. And in Sudan, of course, there are 11 million people who've been displaced, which is the highest number of displacements in the world. Most people are actually displaced because of the conflict there. But I spoke to communities that had been displaced by flooding because there had been unprecedented rains in August, which no one was prepared for. It destroyed housing, it destroyed livelihoods, and it put communities that were already vulnerable into another vulnerable situation. Now, the situation is going to get worse, I'm afraid, unless we all act in a much more energized way than we've been acting. 216 million people are forecast to be displaced by 2050. I mean, that's astronomical, right? Now, there is good news. The World Bank is estimating that if we take action, we can mitigate at least 80% of those displacements. But frankly, getting the attention, getting the resources, getting the financing, getting the political will, all of these things are going to be critical to our success. Now, We're trying to flip this conversation in a couple ways. Number one is we want to draw attention to what's happening in terms of displacement. What are happening to the people who are moving because of the impacts of climate change? We also want to think about how can the migrants themselves be agents of of the change that we need. I find it fascinating that if we want to realize the green climate goals, we actually need migration. We need people to go and do the jobs, to manufacture the solar panels, for example. We need people to be part of the solution. This is not just about a problem. It's not just about the crisis. And where I see the magic is if we can start to connect the people who are needed to drive the solutions with the communities that are impacted and likely to be displaced. So we stop thinking about this as just an aid situation. We think about it as an empowerment situation. So I'm super excited to have the conversation with this panel today. I'm hoping that we leave not just with a sense of the problem. We're all here admiring the problems. We've been admiring the problems for years now. Well, let's think about how we actually build out some solutions and how do we tap into this tremendous potential of the movement of people as a way to drive better outcomes for more. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We can have and yes, thank you so much. And Mrs. Ami, what I really liked about the opening remarks is also I've learned a lot that climate is even displacing more than conflict. That is really a very big insight. And in today's conversation, as you've opened it, we will look at how can migration be actually an agent of change, also a solution to the climate change. And thank you so much. And we will directly move to our panel discussion. And I welcome really our panelists. And we hope that the panel of today will be informative and really interesting. And we have here.
I'd just like to welcome my good friend and partner, the Secretary General of the IFRC. And I'm going to give him my seat here because he is sitting on this panel. I'm so pleased to see you. Thank you for being here, Jacques.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Jagan. Yes, for joining us. And we know that Mr. Jagan is the Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And we know we cannot talk about humanitarian intervention, humanitarian solutions without talking about Red Cross, without talking about the organization that you are representing. And we also have Mrs. Laura, the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator of United States Agency for International Development. And Ms. Laura works on emphasizing the intersection of development, disaster preparedness, and also climate resilience, aiming to reduce the pressures that drive people from their homes. Next, we will also be privileged to have Mrs. Elisa Forgera, yes, Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. Her work mainly focuses on ensuring that human rights are protected. Even if there is migration, still we need to protect the human rights. And also, for our closing remarks, we will have Dr. Julia, and that will help us on closing remark. And that's her work centers on the complex links between climate change and migration and policies. So thank you so much for joining us in this panel. We will, yes. We will start with Mr. Jagan. Mr. Jagan, we know the role of the International Federation of Red Cross. Could you share with us your insights on the opportunities, challenges, and challenges of addressing climate displacement at community level? And if you could also please touch on what solutions for people on the move might look like in practice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Amy and I are a good partner on this issue and also very, very aligned. Let me try to share with you maybe 3 stories, and I can probably answer your questions through stories rather than trying to answer it directly. The first story is I undertook a visit to parts of Africa just to see how migration takes place there, and spend days on the road with the migrants, mostly young people, spending time with them, walking with them, and listening to their stories. One thing that struck with me, although I had read the research and the reports, but listening from the people themselves, around 80% of the people who are on the move from Africa, at least the part I visited, actually did not want to move. This was not their choice. Of course, there is an element of conflict which gets a lot of attention, and rightly so. But there are multiple other reasons people are moving. Vast majority of the people are moving. They are not directly impacted by conflict or war. A lot of them were climate induced, directly or not so directly. So 80% of the people did not want to move. Now, should people not be supported if they don't want to move, to live where they are? And I know at times this becomes political issue, and if you talk about it, suddenly you could be criticized for being anti-migrants or things like that. But this is the first time it is struck to me that 80% of the people do not want to move if they had an option. So that's the first thing. The second thing I learned from them is those who move, 80% of them move within Africa. So being in Geneva, of course, we hear all this news about Europe is invaded, and you hear all these languages. Economically, much weaker countries in Africa were actually observing 80% of them without making much noise, showing incredible generosity. So this is the first story. Can we have the courage to discuss the issues to help people who want to be where they are? Their culture, their tradition, their families, their properties, their histories, their heritage. The second story I want to share with you was when I did a similar trip in the Latin Central America. And this was again a new learning for me. Again, I had read the reports. The issue of the people, of course, generally we have a lot of stories around people moving up north. But the part which I hadn't fully internalized was the people returning back or deported back, whatever you want to call it, in thousands on daily basis. And the general assumption is, oh, when they are returned to the country, that's okay. They are back in their countries. What we saw was that was not that simple. It was very, very tough. And majority of the people who have been returned to the country actually do not go back to their village, for all sorts of reasons. All sorts of reasons. Of course, the original reason haven't been resolved. The causes of their movement hasn't been resolved. But there are multiple other issues of getting back. Also the saying that they were not success. Or people had taken the debt to move. They have no way to pay back. So that was the second story of people returning, what happens. And the third story, which I feel very, very important, and in these discussions, also in discussion in the European capital and other capitals, some of the language we use to describe. We like to use the word migration crisis. And if we present this as a crisis, generally, what is the response to crisis? That's a securitized response. When you have a crisis, you mobilize your security apparatus to deal with the crisis. And we have been trying to change that language. It's actually a phenomenon. And most of the people who are now dead against the movement of the people, just one generation or two generations ago, were migrant themselves. Their parents had migrated. It's a phenomenon that has existed when the people started moving around. So how do we change the language? And many of you, I'm sure, you transit through the big airports, and I transit through many big airports in Europe in last couple of years. Most of the time you will hear the pilot apologizing, saying that, sorry, we are delayed because we simply don't have people to work. So in the same country where there is such a gap of human resources to carry out the basic essential services, the same country's narrative is we cannot have anybody here. To fill the gap, not to take the job away. That's where the opportunity issue comes. There is a clear need. There is a clear need of human resources. There is a clear supply of human resources who are very happy to come and take those responsibilities. So how do we, and I think in our conversation, to change the language, change the narrative, change the language of crisis to change the language of humanity and opportunity, I think we can start making a small difference. And that's basically where the Red Cross and Red Crescent, we are trying to make a small contribution. I know our contribution is small because this is such a heated topic, but I think if we all do our part, I hope we can start changing the needle. Thank you. I can go on, so you have to call the microphone back.
Thank you so much. I would, yes, we can have a round of applause for Mr. Jagan. Thank you so much. We would like you to continue until tomorrow for sure. And I really liked the fact that I'm learning a lot. People who are moving away from their home because of climate crisis often don't go back. And meaning that we need to improve the situation where they are going. And also, it is an opportunity for human resources. People need to learn how to come up with interventions and also supply. Thank you so much for the insight. And next, I would like to invite Mrs. Laura from the USAID. We need to know the approach when it comes to climate change. And Mrs. Laura, can you please share with us how USAID is addressing climate change and migration in policies? And also, I would like also to know what does it look like on ground regarding USAID program in partnering with local communities and for their resilience. And we also like to know, finally, how global partnerships and regional cooperation can contribute when we are planning and preparing the climate-related migration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Israel, for the fantastic question. So I'm happy to talk about, kind of some broader policy trend lines, but I think it's much more interesting to talk about, kind of how we respond to these challenges on the ground. So within USAID, we're certainly very well aware of the fact that climate-related mobility is accelerating, and that a lot of it is projected to be mostly internal, right? And increasingly to urban areas, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. In some cases, migration can really be seen as an adaptation strategy, and however, in many others, unfortunately, it's forced displacement in the face of life-threatening risks. In every case, though, we see that those on the move are among the most vulnerable populations, and many land in urban and peri-urban areas, and that's really critical for reasons that I'm going to come back to. I work on conflict for a living, so I think it's really, really important to focus in on the impact that this migration is having on, both cities' ability to adapt to climate, but also their ability to kind of manage some of the dynamism associated with this movement. But our climate strategy really highlights the need to address climate-related migration by working both with communities and with migrants to limit displacement and to support safer and more productive migration, including both in sending communities but also in receiving communities, right? This can entail things like ensuring tenure and resource security, leveraging remittances and diaspora funding to support climate resilience, supporting social cohesion and peace building, which I'll come back to. And then finally, supporting migrants and displaced people to ensure that they have the capacity and assets that they will be able to take advantage of while they are moving, right? Whether that's transferable job skills, whether that's access to mobile assets, or even access to mobile social safety nets. But I think the last thing I would focus on with respect to policy is that increasingly the U.S. government and USAID as part of the U.S. government are really looking at our approach to climate security and really understanding the ways in which migration, whether that's temporary or permanent migration, is intersecting with issues related to conflict. For our missions around the world, this really means understanding how climate migration is a factor in localized conflict dynamics, and how our programs can work both to increase social cohesion and to provide adequate support to both leaving and receiving communities. So what does this actually look like in our programs? We really take a three-pronged approach. Number one is really focused on improving access to information on climate risks. We want to be investing in adaptation and resilience programs. And then finally, and most importantly, how do we support the people and communities that are most affected by migration? So first, we know that information about climate change impacts and early warning systems, as you and I were talking about even before this session, Israel, is really important to saving lives and empowering governments and communities to take timely and appropriate actions, right? One of the areas that we are really focused on right now is increasing that access to information and really thinking through not just how we can be sharing early warning with respect to floods and extreme weather events, but also the ways in which those extreme weather events intersect with conflict, right? We know, for example, in the context of Sudan and South Sudan, right? We have had historic flooding. What follows that flooding is resource scarcity, whether that's access to fishing areas, whether that's access to land, and we are seeing conflict that is further displacing populations. So I think providing much more multifaceted access to information enables communities to better understand where folks are moving and the needs that they are going to have. That is absolutely critical. Secondly, though, adaptation and resilience actions can help us respond to these key drivers and support those that are moving both as a risk management strategy and also assisting those that are trapped by climate impacts. A lot of our resilience initiatives are really looking first and foremost at those communities that are, kind of receiving populations to enable them to scale actions to build resilience in these contexts. For example, our Asia Resilient Cities activity addresses cross-cutting urban development challenges with a focus on migrants and informal settlement dwellers, right? This can include promoting urban growth, supporting resilient and low-carbon urban infrastructure, and integrating climate change and environmentally conscious urban development approaches. But the third area, and probably the most critical one, is as we see people moving away from climate risk, we really need to be working with migrants and receiving communities to ensure that that mobility is safer, more peaceful, and more productive. For example, in Somalia, where people are moving to urban pressures to escape pressures from climate and conflict, USAID is supporting the Damwadag Durable Solutions Consortium. This consortium is working directly with cities to integrate internally displaced Somalis into neighborhoods and to meaningfully reduce recurrent humanitarian needs by working on secure housing, secure livelihoods, and access to services. So finally, when we talk about global partnerships, I've talked about a few areas where I think that we can be doing a lot more together. USAID is really doubling down on increasing the amount of data that we are able to provide in supporting countries and cities to plan and prepare for climate-related migration. But our resources, and any one of our resources alone, is not going to be equal to the challenge. So we really need to be engaging systemically with the public and private sectors, with non-governmental organizations and civil society to increase the ability of local governments and national governments to take action. But I think, again, working for a development agency, I think it's really critical to come back to the role of cities and communities as really being on the front lines of these issues, right? They need to be addressing both the needs of the migrants that they are receiving, but also in addressing the impacts of climate change on their urban infrastructure and their services and their populations. A lack of preparation, this is where that access to information is so critical, that lack of information and preparation for migration-fueled growth can exacerbate existing social, economic, and environmental stresses. But conversely, when cities are prepared and resourced, migration can contribute to economic growth and development. So back to this issue of where climate and conflict come together. With these populations of cities increasing, it's really imperative, and we are really doubling down our resources within USAID to help people settle into their new urban communities and truly integrate into societies. What does it mean to be making those sorts of investments in social cohesion? So I'll leave you with one more story from USAID's side. One example that we're following closely is out of our mission in Morocco. They have a flagship program called Frasati that focuses on mitigating drivers of conflict and violence. We are seeing that work becoming ever more critical as we're seeing climate change exacerbating existing vulnerabilities to criminality and violence. This is especially the case where cities lack this social cohesion and individual vulnerabilities are particularly acute. This is happening especially in densely populated communities on the both within cities and on the kind of within peri-urban areas. So that program is really looking to think about how they can be focusing on social cohesion among receiving and sending communities, whether that's identifying job and training skills, whether that's building the capacity of social service organizations. So really, as we think about how this manifests both globally and regionally, we really need to be taking these sorts of multifaceted approaches, increasing access to data, really thinking about how we can be working to support cities in playing this role, both with respect to urban infrastructure and planning, but also with respect to conflict resolution and social cohesion. We need to be thinking regionally, and this is where colleagues like IOM are so incredibly important, not only to ensure that that social safety net exists across borders, but also, frankly, to be learning from one another, to be taking these opportunities to be convening and learning and adapting to this emerging challenge. And I'm just so thankful to IOM for having us all here for today's conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. I really like the intervention, Mrs. Laura. So I'm happy to hear that migration it is also an adaptation strategy, and also how we can improve information about migrated people, and also to create cohesion with the receiving community, because sometimes it can also create conflict, and also to um, reinforce the resilience capabilities of the people who are moving, so that they can learn maybe job skills, so that they can uh, take advantage of their new location. Thank you really so much for the insight. And now we have Mrs. Elisa, the UN Special Rapporteur. And when I see you, Mrs. Elisa, I see human rights directly, and then we are going to talk about it in your intervention. And we want to know, what are the existing policies and framework that can guide the responses to climate-driven displacement? And also we need to know the primary challenges implementing those frameworks. And additionally, we want to know how climate policies can consider the right of all individuals, even the individuals with disabilities. And I would like to know, because it is really concerning myself, my situation. And we want also to, would like also to know, please, we would like also to know, how can human rights-based approaches help support communities in climate-affected regions as they adapt, ensuring access to essential services, livelihood opportunities, and environmental protections to bolster resilience? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really so important for me to be here in this conversation. I think we often still see human rights as an add-on to the important work that we're doing in humanitarian and development intervention. But in fact, everything that has been mentioned so far has really resonance with the work that myself, but also many other UN special rapporteurs on human rights in areas that you might not think have to do with mobility or climate change have been doing, realizing how the impacts of climate-induced mobility is having demonstrable, predictable, and now well-documented impacts on the rights of persons with disabilities, on women and girls, on older persons, on persons who are already facing poverty and racial discrimination and other forms of structural injustices. And it's really important to, I think, relate to this work that UN human rights bodies are doing, both as a source of information, in fact, critical data that can be included in all preventive efforts, but also because I think the guidelines that has been developed by multiple colleagues of mine and that I have synthesized in my first report, which was discussed at the Human Rights Council in July, really provide such precious approaches, very practical approaches about ensuring intersectionality in our responses and in our preventive measures on climate-induced human mobility. And I should say that this guidance is often addressed to states. There's an effort to clarify how existing human rights obligations, say under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention against discrimination against women, the Convention on the Human Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and many other, how they can be read in a way that can guide and make, in fact, more effective action in relation to climate change more generally and also the negative impacts of climate change. But the understanding of state obligations also sheds light on what UN bodies and agencies can do, how we can better work in terms of international cooperation. Of course, the role of donors, multilateral and bilateral, and the responsibility of business enterprises who are often partners but sometimes can be part of the problem in relation to the negative impacts on human rights of climate change and climate-induced mobility. And maybe the third general point I'll make before going into some practical examples to show the contributions of international human rights law to our conversation is also the point that was made at the very beginning around how those persons whose human rights are most affected by climate change, and that is really the case of persons who find themselves having to move because of climate change, those are some of the top climate experts we can talk to. And we should listen to them. We should recognize that their lived experience, their perspectives are as important as those of the IPCC chairs. And this is really essential because the effects of climate change have way beyond our collective imagination. As I was saying, many of my colleagues have documented how climate-induced mobility has led to gender-based violence, has exposed many human rights holders to modern forms of slavery, to human trafficking. All of this compounded with many other challenges they're facing as they're moving because of those continuous situations of violations of vulnerability due to age discrimination, disability discrimination, gender, and so on. So this paints a bleak picture, but I think everything that we're learning is precious for us to prevent, for us to identify more effective climate action. And I guess the other point I would like to make is that we're often thinking about climate-induced mobility as a matter of adaptation, but I think what we're learning and the gravity of the situation is also an essential piece of evidence for decisions on climate mitigation. How much, how quickly, how effective we need climate mitigation to prevent further massive climate-induced human mobility, but equally paying attention to when some of the choices in terms of climate mitigation responses are themselves leading to displacement. And unfortunately, we have documentation of this. I think the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights has already documented cases in which carbon markets have led to the displacement of people, including indigenous peoples, from their territories. And as we saw today, at the start of this very COP, we're kind of fast-tracking carbon markets as a climate mitigation response, but we have to look at the evidence, and we really need to think about what is the best science available telling us about our prioritization of climate mitigation responses. And the evidence is the data we've heard, is the experiences, the lived experiences of those who are forced to move, and I think all the knowledge that all the colleagues and partners working with them have. And I think, it's great that we're here at the Climate COP, but we are still maybe on the margins, and I think the contributions of this community and the people we serve should be much more central in that piece around climate science, and hopefully something that we can explore with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well, which, interesting enough, is having a scoping meeting in December, which will I attend, and I hope others will. But going more now into maybe the details of what are some of the contributions that human rights experts have developed to contribute to the work that's already ongoing. I think, first of all, an attention to the continuum between voluntary and forced mobility, and how along that continuum the vulnerability of affected individuals and communities varies and is affected by multiple and often increasing grounds of discrimination and marginalization, while limited or no resources are or become unavailable to them while they try to adapt. And so what that means is, again, we have precious indications around when early warning systems, where adaptation measures are not either have been conceived in terms of, say, disability inclusiveness, age inclusiveness, gender responsiveness, and equally where the information is not accessible to all groups. And whenever any state finds themselves in that situation, which often because of the unexpectedness, because of the time pressures, the important thing is to document and learn and bring that learning back and redevelop those systems with those who have been most affected to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes. Those mistakes have happened, but they are now predictable and preventable. And we go back then to that point around how persons with disabilities, women and girls, indigenous peoples, persons in poverty who find themselves on the move because of climate change need to be included at the earliest stages possible of that design of climate response measures, as well as in their implementation and monitoring, because this is where, again, the cycle of learning will continue. It is iterative learning necessarily. And what that means is that the space for participation, for recognition of the value of their lived experiences, of their knowledge, making sure that the spaces for participation are inclusive in terms of age, gender, and disabilities, and that there are resources that are specifically devoted and, in fact, prioritized to ensuring that that knowledge is central and is put in conversation, in a fruitful conversation with other sources of knowledge and sciences and areas of experience that are shaping, I think, this area of cooperation. Another critical point is education. I've actually been involved in a few conversations before and during COP around the role of education at all levels, and in fact how the human right to education of children, but also other persons, is negatively impacted by climate change and by climate-induced mobility, and how much information is essential and needs to be as in line as possible with our best information, again, across all those areas of expertise and lived experiences, to allow everyone to be better able to protect themselves and to contribute to others' protection, and every single public agency and private enterprise and UN body to really perform to the best of their abilities that protection of human rights, which again is something that is now more foreseeable than it was before. There's also interesting consideration that have been identified by some of my colleagues in terms of thinking about who needs the access to information or training. I think humanitarian aid officers and experts, aid workers, they might not all be familiar with human rights and with these insights from human rights about how to the needs of women and girls, other persons with disabilities, older persons who might need particular accessibility conditions ensured for them to be able to benefit from early warning responses and more kind of ongoing responses available to them. And maybe the final point is also about where we get to the stage of peace building and rebuilding. That is another critical stage where we can't just look ahead, but we need to, again, maximize, make sure we take all that learning from the lived experiences and their needs. Do they want to remain? Do they want to return? What has been lost in terms of culture, in terms of tenure, the full range of their human rights. And again, this may appear daunting, in a phase of reconstruction, but it is essential for conflict not to continue or return. And something I have learned recently, I think, is how there's data now showing how often humanitarian interventions, because of that time pressure, lead to significant environmental damage. And that in and of itself then puts communities, even 3 months, I think, mere 3 months after, in a worse condition in terms of looking after their own well-being and safety, and maybe having to move again. So all that show how important that rebuilding phase is in terms of dealing with that time pressure, but really making sure that we are taking into account all the priorities and lived experiences and make space for those participatory processes for co-design to really maximize the opportunities of that being a meaningful, contextual, and longer-lasting response.
The understanding of the human rights can be different, and if we don't collaborate, we cannot make it possible. And also, the access of information of different groups, mainly people with disabilities, because we have so many groups of people with disability, mainly people who cannot hear and talk. Sometimes they have difficult access of information. They don't know what to do in time of crisis. So I am happy that you brought it also into discussions. And let me thank everyone, like all the panelists, for the wonderful insight that you've just provided to all of us. And I would like every one of you saying one sentence on the vision of and also the ambition regarding the climate mobility. We will start with Mr. Jagan. Thank you.
I think the key word for me here is how to empower and expand the choices available to the people so that they can choose to stay home. If they decide to move, there is a safety and protection. And if they reach a point of destination, they can have a dignified life. So it's really expanding the choices available. Also, what you just said, the part of making the choices available is also the unique needs. You so nicely talked about your own situation. And general solutions are not always enough for people with disabilities. So how to also identify the choices available for people with unique needs? For me, that's really the key here. Thank you.
So if I were to sum this up in one word, I think it would be understanding, right? First and foremost, the need for all of us in the global community to better understand the intersectionality of climate and conflict and mobility. Understanding of potential strategies, right? And frankly, the resources that are going to be available to cities that we see at the epicenter of responding to this challenge. But then also understanding of the needs of migrants and the communities that are accepting them, right? And that is going to be absolutely critical to strengthening the social cohesion that we need for effective resilience strategies, but also, frankly, for much more, kind of effective interpersonal relationships and ideally, kind of inclusive governance, right? That's going to be critical for all of us as a global community to better manage this challenge in the years ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe from my side, just to say that the question like empowering, understanding, inclusiveness and choices, they're all matters of human rights. This is where we have relevant and applicable binding international obligations, but those obligations are also what illuminates the path ahead, and I think in and of itself empowers those who are most affected by climate change, not only to ask and expect as a favor, as a nice to have, but really be owed these kind of responses and being recognized for that value that they can contribute and they can in fact make all the work that we've discussed more effective, more meaningful, and I think help us along the broader challenge of climate change as well.
Thank you so much, and we ask you panelists to stay a little bit, and we have a gift for you, participants. 10 minutes remaining for you to bring your thoughts or your questions, and our panelists here they will answer and also follow with comments. First question, Mr. Farah. We have, and then we'll have one. We can take a series of 3 questions first, and then we.
Thank you so much for this very important discussion. I think this is the real thing that is affecting the world. I have 2 questions and 3 questions. One is I'm from Somalia, and Somalia is a country that is a best example when it comes to disasters and climate shocks. Looking at it from different angles, be it be conflicts over resources, migration, looking at now climatic shocks, 6-month drought, the next year floods, then the migration from the rural areas to urban areas. And then last week on 6th and 7th, I participated in an annual conference on looking at climate shocks or disaster-induced migration. And then it was a research that was presented by different people. And what they were all discussing was that people are not willing to return to their rural villages. So what can be the solution? And the solution is now, is there a space to incorporate them in the urban areas, move them out from the camps, settlements, which is not a one-day or one-off solution. That's one. I think it's good to think, or important to think out of the box and find a way of now having programs in the rural villages to prevent migration. And that's one important thing. The second one is there is a lot of humanitarian organization support to Somalia, but are they making a difference? Looking at now handouts, is that sustainable? So I think it's important to look at supporting projects that have community involvement in terms of cash for work, in terms of farming, in terms of cooperatives, in terms of small-scale farming, in terms of small industries, so that this handout-based, which is creating dependence syndrome, is now moved from to a community involvement syndrome. The other important thing I think that Madame mentioned is the access to information. During the 2022 flooding, and what we got was the climate and information in terms of the early warning systems. The early warning information using the local media was very, very helpful, particularly the rural people, because they were warning them to move out or to move away from the flooding zones. And that really helped. But people lost their animals. I have a practical example of someone I talked to said, I lost 50 camel because they could not cross the flooding. And then I moved out with my kids. I left them there and they all died. So I think it's important to look at the rural and community support, not only focusing on the urban areas. And access to information is very, very important. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kira Finke, German Council on Foreign Relations. My question is on how to direct more funding towards those on the move in the context of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one question, it is Mr. there behind. You can introduce yourself whenever you have the mic, please.
Thank you. I don't have a question actually, but I just want to thank the head of the IOM there earlier. So my name is Mustafa Abbas. I'm the active youth coordinator for the Canadian Council for Refugees. I'm a Sudanese refugee. And she mentioned that also there's people in Sudan that got displaced with the floods and climate change effects other than the conflict. And this is not like I barely hear it in these places. So I really want to thank her about that because like my whole village got destroyed by the flood, and so most of the people migrated and some people stayed, but most of the people migrated. But I don't hear that in these spaces, and this is really important thing to talk about because there is a conflict in the country, and people got also affected with climate change and environmental disaster. So yeah, that's just a comment that I wanna bring it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the comments. Thank you so much. And now we have two types of question. One related to humanitarian responses, and another related to funding. I think all the panelists can kind of tap into regarding, but we will start with Mr. Jagan.
I think I leave the funding part to USA. No, I think the gentleman left, but I think those were more comments than questions. I think what he said make a lot of sense. That's where I think the few systemic issues have been creating a lot of challenge for us. We created humanitarian silos, the development silos, and now we are creating climate silos, and we have created a peace as a silo. And that has been a huge challenge. This funding silos doesn't allow us to maximize the use of resources. We ourselves face a situation that they say, oh, this is a humanitarian funding, so you can only spend in Somalia, but you cannot spend in neighboring countries where the needs could be much greater. So addressing the systemic silos that was created, and I know this has been talked about, and I know it's not easy, but at some point this needs to be addressed because for people, they don't differentiate their needs and aspirations on the basis of humanitarian development, peace, climate. The needs are needs and the aspirations are aspirations. So that's, I think, a big issue. And I think for us as an IFRC, we don't divide our program as such. We work on continuum. And this is what we are pushing. And so one of the reasons we have difficulty with the donors is because we work in continuum and we don't become attractive because the donors are looking for humanitarian fund, development fund, but we don't work like that. And we continue to push to work on continuum. And that's really a key issue. The other issue the gentleman highlighted was around how do we balance between the immediate humanitarian response, which is again needed. If we cannot save the people, then the investing afterwards doesn't mean anything. So it's not either or. We need to come out of this either or mindset that there is a humanitarian response needed. Immediately you save lives, but don't stop there. Then you need to have a longer term resilience building, reconstruction that is done in a climate smart way that look into the human rights and human rights issues into consideration. And then maybe the final point I really want to make here, and some of the comments that came, the real development challenge we have seen, also the humanitarian intervention challenge we have seen is there is a lack of investment in the local capacity. It's talked about, there's a lot of lip service around that, but it is still heavily imposed solutions on the communities. And not enough respect for the leadership that can come from within the communities. And we, being a very community-based organization, we have seen hundreds of millions thrown with very little impact, and we have seen just tens of thousands spent through the community and making a real impact. But how do we change this? It's been very, very, very tough. We just had a grand bargain meeting a few weeks ago in Geneva. Less than 2% of the funding now are channeled to the local actors. Less than 2%, 1.27% or something like that in 2023. And this is after 10 years of commitment. In 2015, that commitment was made. And we do have an instrument. I can boast the instrument we have in the IFSC, where we have 83% of the funding we have been able to channel to the local actors. That's called the Disaster Response Emergency Fund. So there are tools, there are successful tools. But how do we then incentivize the successful tools so others actually get incentivized? And at the moment, I don't see enough of that. I believe the large international organizations, they really don't want to change. For donors, it's very easy to give money to these big organizations, and it's your problem because then they manage the risk. But if we continue to stay in our comfort zone, the change is not going to happen. And this is, I think, one of our messages. Let's come ourselves out of our comfort zone.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Jordan. So we will hand over to Mrs. Laura for funding question, and then we'll go straight to the closing remarks. You have the floor, Mrs. Liz.
So I'm going to pick up on 2 points that the Secretary General has raised that I think are really incredibly important. So certainly could not agree more with respect to the humanitarian development peace nexus. I'm sorry that Farah had left because I was going to flag the fact that Somalia is actually one of our focus countries within USAID for doing exactly this sort of work. Because, frankly, one of the things that we're finding working in the climate space is that for every dollar that we're spending on prevention and really looking farther upstream at the at the root causes of conflict and resource management, we're seeing $2 to $13 in cost savings down the road, right? So we really do need to be making the investments upstream, but frankly also to be making the case, because I think one of the big challenges that we see is if you look at the 20 countries that are most affected by climate change around the world, they are nowhere near the top recipients of climate change funding. This is a massive issue. And so I also wanted to follow up on the point around localization and the importance of directing funding, right? I could not agree more. I think the challenge that we have, and this is an area where USAID is doubling down, is we have the potential for hundreds of millions of dollars in green climate funding, right? But there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done on the other side. Again, Somalia being a really great example of a country that is actually attracting climate finance right now. But we on the donor side have a lot of work to do to ensure that those governments actually have got the the institutions and processes in place to be able to effectively manage that funding, right, and to manage it inclusively, so that that adaptation work is actually going to be strengthening resilience rather than potentially fomenting conflict between communities, right? The reality of it is the places that need the most fundings are the ones that are most vulnerable, and frankly not only most vulnerable to climate change but to conflict as well. So I think that there's a lot more that we need to be doing as donors to ensure that the governments that really need the funding the most have the systems in place to actually be able to effectively program that funding to the needs of all of the communities that they serve, including migrant communities. Can I hand it over to Elisa?
Yes. Thank you so much.
30 seconds?
Yes, you are granted.
Thank you so much. Just to say that question of prioritizing communities as having direct access to financing, including international financing, is actually an international human rights obligation. Again, human rights shed light also on that aspect. But I think fundamentally then, that also helps with some of the tasks that are difficult at higher levels, those gaps in information, that is existing knowledge in the communities, understanding of their needs. This is what the communities can provide and shape. And there's a lot of potential for mutual learning for all those working with the communities and taking some learning in other parts of the world where maybe we're not seeing the same severity or frequency of climate events yet. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And we would like now to invite Dr. Julia from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the International Youth Federation. You have the floor.
Yes,
Dr.
is this one
Julia.
working?
Yes, it's
okay,
working.
Super.
Yeah.
So I realize I'm standing between some of you and lunch, so I'll try to keep it short and consider protocol respected. But of course, I have to express my gratitude to IOM for inviting me to share some reflections to close out this event today. And of course, thanks to the moderator and to the panelists for a really rich and inspiring discussion. After about a decade working in the field on climate change and migration, as well as supporting youth advocates, I really do agree with the panel here that climate-related migration is accelerating, and not simply a matter of the future, but accelerating today. And in the highly affected climate areas, we do our research in around the world, many people have really limited capacities and little to no safety nets. And only really in the best of circumstances are certain households able to plan proactively to migrate to respond to adverse environmental events. And those are the households with advantages and with good access to information, as Laura and Elisa pointed out. And unfortunately, these best of circumstances are very rare. And yet, in my research, when we ask climate-related or climate-affected people to reflect in the past about strategies that they used to effectively respond to adverse environmental events, they consistently list migration in the top 3. So it means people may not be able to prepare in the future to migrate in response to climate change, but they consider it in the past to be an effective strategy. So what we can learn from this is that when we refer to migrants as agents of change, we don't need to focus only on the entrepreneurial unicorns that plan to migrate, but also those who may migrate reactively. In climate hotspots, even reactive migration can be part of successful strategies. Migration happens, and it works. So positive migration experiences also must be supported at multiple steps along the migration journey. And governments and their partners can do quite a lot to foster the conditions for migration to be positive and increase adaptive capacities for the migrants themselves, the areas of origin and destination areas. And these solutions for people to move include critical support for these migration journeys. As we heard from DG Pope earlier and was discussed also in the discussion here, there can be magic really in connecting migrants with their destination areas, and improving safe, regular, and dignified migration pathways is really essential in this. These pathways will offer climate-affected communities the chance to adapt, the chance to preserve their livelihoods, and also access to stability. However, we also heard that it's equally important to support solutions for people who want to stay and want to stay in dignity. The SG of the IFRC pointed out that many people do not want to leave. In some contexts, even a majority of people do not want to leave. Yet, what my research confirms is this story that there are multiple factors in migration, and I've shown that repeated climate shocks over time weaken capacities in the long term, making migration all but unavoidable for certain families in certain contexts. So we need to make sure that migration remains a matter of choice whenever possible. We heard an example from Sudan that a lot of governments have limited capacities to respond to adverse environmental events, limited capacities to support people, but small adjustments can make a big difference, and small investments in local capacities can make a big difference, as Laura pointed out. We heard a number of examples about how to invest in local capacities and how to support adaptive migration. For example, as Laura mentioned, maximizing the development potential of remittances, especially by supporting diaspora groups. As we know, they increase their support to origin communities in the aftermath of disasters and hazards. And we can also support social cohesion and cultural cohesion. As Elisa pointed out, this can also be done in partnerships with governments, with companies, and in a participatory manner. Some of the most powerful examples that I've personally seen in the field of supporting local capacities is sustainable agriculture through extension services, things like drought-resistant seeds, and also decreasing the costs of internal as well as international remittances. So I think we all agree that among the solutions for people on the move is to consider that climate mobility, when supported appropriately, can be a development opportunity and not just a crisis response. At the same time, as we heard from Elisa, we do have to consider those who are affected by human mobility may have negative impacts on cultural heritage, social cohesion, and we need to make sure to include the voices of affected people in all stages of knowledge development and policy design. So in that vein, I'm actually delighted to be part of an IOM-led research project on non-economic loss and damage and how it relates to human mobility, which is under the guidance of the Task Force on Displacement, and this is something that should be coming out very soon. Overall, we see climate mobility centers on people. Thanks to the panel again.
Thank you so much for Dr. Julia, for the closing remarks, and thank you very much for, thank you, dear panelists, for your insightful interventions, and thank you very much for the participants because of your patience. You know, we were a little bit, okay, we were over time, but you were patient with us. And ladies and gentlemen, it was a side event on shaping our vision for climate mobility under UN Migration, IOM, in IOM Climate Change and Human Mobility Pavilion. Thank you so much for attending. Have a nice day and time at COP.